Hey guys, how's it going? So I am here to talk about King Lear by William Shakespeare. I just reread this completely on a whim. I picked it up at about 10 p.m. on Sunday and read almost half of it, and then read the next half the next morning. And yeah, I just had been in the mood for some Shakespeare rereads lately and had been sort of putting them off, and then finally just gave in. I have been making progress on my January TBR, but this is the first aberration from that I've accepted so far. I've obviously already done one video about King Lear. I did one for ShakeTube 2017. You remember ShakeTube 2017 all the way back then? And yeah, I haven't gone back to rewatch my old video because I didn't want what I thought then to bias what I thought of it now. So I'm gonna probably go back and rewatch it as soon as I finish making this video. But yeah, I just wanted to put this video out there and just get my thoughts out. I'm hoping that my thoughts are a bit different than they were the first time. I can't remember quite. I remember vaguely what they were the first time, but I think I saw some more things in this than I did the first time I read it. So just to give an introduction for anyone who doesn't know King Lear, it's obviously one of Shakespeare's masterpieces. But it is about, funnily enough, a guy named King Lear. And he is the king of Britain who, at the beginning of this play, decides to divide his kingdom between his three daughters, Goneril, Regan, and Cordelia. And he basically, in the first scene, tells the three daughters that he's going to divide his kingdom between them, and then he's going to just keep living basically the same way that he lived as king, but without all the responsibility, essentially. And so he tells his daughters that he will divide the kingdom of three, and they need to tell him, before he divides the kingdom, they need to tell him how much each of them loves him. They need to articulate how much they love him. And those who, the one who expresses her love the most eloquently will get the biggest chunk, and the one who's the least elegant will get the smallest chunk. And Goneril and Regan, wax poetically and somewhat hypocritically, it should be said, about how they love their father so dearly. But then the youngest, Cordelia, who is also the daughter that King Lear has always loved the most, says that she can't articulate her love for him, and that she has to save half of the love that she has to give for her husband, basically. And this pisses King Lear off, so he basically just ends up deciding the king in half between Goneril and Regan, and disowns Cordelia, and tells her that she's banished from his court. And in this scene, at the end of this scene, the King of France, who happens to be present, because the King of France and also the Duke of Burgundy were both there, because they were both interested in possibly marrying Cordelia. The King of France generously offers to marry Cordelia and take her to France with him, even though she now has no dowry at all because her father has just disowned her. So Cordelia leaves for France, and Lear is then left alone, and basically, the way he wants to live is he wants to alternate living with Goneril and Regan in their respective quarters. So he has a retinue of 100 knights with him. And basically, Goneril and Regan just get more and more pissed off at him because of how rowdy he is with his knights. They kind of want to decrease the number of people he can have in his retinue, until they basically tell him that they would rather if he just didn't have any retinue, and if he just allowed himself to be completely subservient to them and taken care of by them. And then they sort of inexplicably just get super angry at him and basically banish him, and he runs out onto the heath, into the wilderness with his fool, and basically goes completely insane. That storyline moves forward from there, and there's a second storyline with the Duke of Gloucester, who is about the same age as King Lear. They're both quite old, and the Duke of Gloucester has two sons, Edmund and Edgar, and Edmund is a bastard son, and he is sort of a second Iago, who wants to have his brother and his father killed, and take over as Duke of Gloucester, and later on wants to have Lear and all of his daughters killed so that he can then become King of Britain as well. But as Harold Bloom says, Edmund is actually even more effective than Iago, because he actually succeeds at his plan, whereas Iago doesn't. So a sort of similar fate to Lear befalls the Duke of Gloucester. What happens with the Duke of Gloucester is he shows sympathy for King Lear and tries to help him a little bit after he's been banished, and Goneril and Regan and their husbands find out about this, and Edmund sort of snitches on his own father, tells them this, and they're not happy with it, so they pluck out his eyes, as you do, and then he gets banished out onto the heath as well. And he's there with his legitimate son, Edgar, whom he, earlier in the play, had wanted to kill because Edmund had convinced Gloucester that it was Edgar who was scheming to have Gloucester killed. But Edgar is now out on the heath, disguised as a madman named Tom o' Bedlam, which, incidentally, there's a really good anonymous poem from, I think, around the time when Shakespeare was alive, called Tom o' Bedlam's Song. Just kind of an interesting connection. But, yeah, so Gloucester wanders around the heath, guided by this person who he thinks is a madman, but who is actually his son. The story moves forward from there to a really horrifically powerful climax, really. In my opinion, having read this play twice and listened to a production of it, it really is, in my opinion, I mean, just one of the most magnificent artistic creations that any person has created. This truly is a masterpiece. And, you know, for a long time, I've been saying that Macbeth was my favorite Shakespeare play. And certainly I still love it. I have more Macbeth committed to memory than any other Shakespeare play, which isn't actually saying that much, but still. But I think King Lear is slowly overtaking it. I think King Lear, for me, King Lear is Shakespeare's most powerful tragedy. For me, you know, both times I've read it, it has just emotionally destroyed me. You know, it's, you know, I remember Steve Donahue saying that it's like the epitome of catharsis, of this Aristotelian idea of catharsis and how it just washes you out and you come out completely clean after this immersive experience with this really intense tragedy. And yeah, I agree. I see this play as just a look into a world where there are no gods, or if there are, they don't care about us and are probably even hostile. And it's a look into a world where nothing matters, and there really is no firm constellation, I don't think, in the world that King Lear provides us with. I read Marjorie Garber's chapter on King Lear in her book, Shakespeare After All, and she tries to argue that there is a little bit of constellation in King Lear, especially in the scene where King Lear is finally reunited with Cordelia, and they show their love for each other. But I perhaps find that convincing, if not entirely compelling, just because the immensity of the tragedy at the end of the day is so horrific. But yeah, anyway, I love this play. Just some things I noticed on this reading. I particularly noticed all the references to sight and seeing and eyes throughout this play. Marjorie Garber points out that is common. That's a very old piece of criticism on King Lear, that there's a lot of reference to sight and seeing and eyes. But I just noticed it a lot while I read it this time, and I didn't notice it the first time. Probably because the first time I was still sort of getting situated with the story. But yeah, and it's interesting on that score because it reminded me a lot of Oedipus Rex in that sense, because, of course, Oedipus Rex also ends with Oedipus blinding himself. And here we have Gloucester, who is literally blinded, and King Lear, who is arguably sort of metaphorically blinded. You know, there are a lot of similarities between King Lear and Oedipus Rex, and the Oedipus trilogy in general. I mean, we have, obviously, the king in the case of Oedipus, but Duke of Gloucester in this case, who are blinded literally. And we have basically the complete collapse of Oedipus, of the House of Thebes in the Theban trilogy. At least I think by the end of the third play, basically his entire family is gone. And here in King Lear, we have the complete extinction of Lear's family. But in Oedipus and the subsequent plays in the Theban trilogy, at least I find that there's always preserved a sense that this is ordained by the gods, and that in a sense this is all happening for a reason. And then yes, it's horrible, but there is some sense behind it why it's happening, even if it's the will of sort of temperamental, fickle gods. At least there is some will behind it. Whereas in King Lear, there doesn't seem to me to be any real sense behind it, other than that Edmund, feels like he's been wronged his whole life and now wants to be king. Given the sense of nihilism that at least I detect in other plays of Shakespeare's, like Hamlet especially, but also Othello with Iago, I do think it's possible that is the sense we're supposed to come away with. But I don't know. Maybe other people are more convinced by Marjorie Garber's argument that that love is a way of redeeming this world that King Lear portrays, because the Duke of Gloucester ends up dying essentially of a mixture of joy and pain when he realizes that it's Edgar who's been by his side the whole time. So there is that, as well as the scene with Cordelia and King Lear. Another thing I noticed that I thought was super interesting when I read it this time was that this play at times almost seems more like a black comedy than a tragedy. I think my favorite scene in the entire play is a great example of this. At one point, when Gloucester is being guided around by Edgar on the heath, Gloucester asks Edgar to take him to a cliff so that he can throw himself off to his death. Edgar, it's this like weirdly funny scene where Edgar is telling Gloucester, who's blind, that they're on the upward slope to the cliff, and Gloucester's like, it doesn't feel like we're going uphill, and Edgar's like, yeah, well, we are. It's really I'm getting tired. And then Gloucester's like, oh, really? And then they get to the cliff, and they don't get to the cliff. Edgar tells Gloucester that they get to the cliff. And Gloucester's like, it doesn't feel like the summit of a cliff. I don't feel much wind. And Edgar's like, whoa, I'm totally being blown away by the wind right now. And then Gloucester's like, okay, well, you can go stand off. I'm going to go jump to my death. And then he jumps and then just kind of lands on his face. It is a strangely comic scene. And then you, of course, have the Fool as well, who accompanies Lear all across the heath, who is constantly cracking jokes and making fun of everyone around him. This sort of reminded me of something from the philosophy of Arthur Schopenhauer, who, for anyone who doesn't know, was a 18th and 19th century German philosopher who is known as a philosophical pessimist. And one of the things that he famously said was that life is a comedy in the short term, but a tragedy in the long term. And I almost feel like I can see that that aphorism being played out in King Lear. Because we have these oddly, unsettlingly comic moments, but then you have the horrific ending of King Lear. Those are my thoughts on King Lear upon a second reading. I do think I got a lot more out of it. I'm gonna go rewatch my first video and see. I think this is one I will be rereading for many years to come. I may have to, after rereading King Lear, I may have to resist going on a big Shakespeare rereading binge, because I'm already going to be having one when we have ShakeTube 2019 in September. But anyway, I kind of feel inclined to reread Hamlet and Antony and Cleopatra, and also possibly The Tempest. So, I don't know, but if I do, you will be the first to know. So, anyway, King Lear by William Shakespeare. Go read it if you haven't, and anyway. Thanks for talking, guys. Goodbye.